Hello and welcome to another GeoTech Hour. I'm your host, Dr. David Bray, inaugural director of the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center, and we are the program that's talking about how to be bold, how to be brave, and how to be benevolent as we embrace a future in which technology and data will have disproportionate impacts on societies, on geopolitics, and how we collaborate as humans across the planet. Today, we're talking about the impact of autonomous systems that are using AI. And we want to distinguish that autonomous systems are things that operate independent of human action, whereas artificial intelligence is the ability to make sense of an environment in a way that seems to sometimes emulate human thought. You can have AI systems that are not autonomous. You can have autonomous systems that don't involve AI. What we're really talking about today is the combination of the both. When you're actually having an autonomous system that is now free from human direction, as well as AI, and in particular, a subset of AI called machine learning that is helping to guide what the autonomous system does. News has been made recently in which there are some concerns in which there are possibilities that drones have been used by certain countries and certain regions where they're looking at using autonomous systems to track down people and possibly even do worse. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that autonomous systems have value as well, especially with responding to, say, forest fires or emergencies, or even cases where somebody is injured, you can't get a physical doctor to them, but possibly you could get an autonomous system with AI to provide initial first response and medical relief. So today we're going to discover and explore the human dimensions of this conversation. I'm really excited because we have a very august panel of experts to talk about this today as we explore this space again, leading with benevolence. I want to first welcome from the United Kingdom's House of Lords, Lord Tim Clement-Jones, longtime friend of the GeoTech Center. And I want to go to you first, Lord Tim, with a question. So why is this conversation about autonomous systems so timely and important now?
Well, funny enough, we looked at this in our House of Lords report, which seems a long time ago. 3 years in the world of AI is a very long time ago. But at that moment, we looked at the definitions of artificial intelligence. And, for instance, you take Brad Smith's definition, which is software that learns from experience. Well, if you are a piece of software learning from experience, the possibility of autonomy is quite high because you then get into a cycle where actually you are effectively self-propelled. Now you add to that issues related to black boxes. Then you start getting into quite deep water in terms of liability, accountability, and so on. And then if you go into the sort of military area, then it becomes even more complicated. And we found, and we were, quite surprised by this, we found that our military were defining autonomy in a very peculiar way. They said an autonomous system is capable of understanding higher level intent and direction. We thought, this use of the word understanding, and they said, oh, we don't have anything like that because, of course, there is no AI system that has any understanding. And so effectively, this was a semantic way of parking a problem way into the future. Well, we'll come on to this later, but I'm glad to say that actually NATO now does have a much better definition of autonomy, but what we don't have is a proper definition of lethal autonomous weapons, and that then takes us into other areas. But you take the chain of logic through, and you begin to get worried, and you really have to say to yourself, well, what kinds of risks are acceptable to be taken where there is this potential for autonomy?
Very well said. And I'd like to ask you, Lord Tim, that as we look at this, one, I often tell people to replace the word, when they use the word AI, to replace it with really advanced mathematics and see if it still makes sense. And so that sort of passes your test. Like, are we subscribing that really advanced mathematics has understanding? But then two, if I could ask you, you hit the nail on the head on what risks are acceptable. And so I guess the question is, in your mind, is this something where it's something that the military should make sense of? Is it something that maybe the House of Lords or Parliament should make sense of? Or something that maybe the public should have a voice in? And how do we actually get inputs into these risks in a way that is not trying to do every individual case, because that would be too much, but at least have broad public input as to how we consider these things?
Well, I think it's a mixture of those. I mean, the duty of politicians, and it's why I got involved in AI. I mean, I'm not a tech a techie. I'm a humble lawyer, if there are any humble lawyers out there. But I thought, well, look, nobody else is really grappling with this. We've got to start thinking about this. There are politicians there who really don't understand the implications of this. And once you start thinking about the implications, then it's our role to put pressure on the military, the people who run our Ministry of Defense and the Prime Minister and so on, to actually come to agreement on this kind of limitation, if you like, of this kinds of really lethal autonomous system weaponry that we wouldn't have any control over. I'm a great believer in AI and the opportunities of AI, but it's got to be our servant, not our master. And that's the problem with autonomy. If you're not careful, the roles get reversed.
Very well said. And I also appreciate you leading so benevolently in this exploration, in this inquiry, because you're right. If nobody starts raising the questions now, then it's something that either A, will be glossed over, or a missed opportunity for us to think about. So I really appreciate you embodying a positive change agent in those conversations, Lord Tim. And I'd like to welcome to the show another longtime friend and positive change agent, Sally Grant. Sally, you have done a lot of this effort, and you have been a champion of a lot of different conversations involving linking tech to inform the US Congress. But in this capacity, I really want to ask you more, why do you think that we actually should have these conversations now? And why is it so important to start considering about how we are linking autonomous systems to AI?
Thank you, Dr. David Bray. I appreciate that. Working with the Department of Defense, this is critical mission. This is a concern for us all. This is a raised level for the Five Eyes. And as I work currently now with our greatest scientists and engineers for national security and global security, as artificial intelligence and federated, let's be clear, federated machine learning in the autonomous space progresses due to, let's be specific, adversarial threats. That is our focus. Our goal needs to be to reduce inadvertent escalation. That is the most important. I believe it is important to reduce inadvertent escalation by field testing with our allies hand in hand, and to create guidelines and policy similar to our nuclear deterrent programs. I believe this can save lives, because when a contested environment and a machine-to-machine needs to make those decisions, those machines need to be prepared to understand the risk of human life for the enemy and for ourselves and our allies. Thank you.
Well, I mean, there's a lot there that if you allow me to ask a few rejoinders and unpack one first. I really appreciate that you said that this is a case where it's almost like the nuclear regime, where we don't want things to escalate. We want things to de-escalate, which I think is a wonderful way to sort of cast this. And then two, you talked about federated learning. Maybe if we could unpack that for our audience. When we talk about federated learning, what we're really saying, and I'd be open to result, is it's that it's no one system making a decision. It's multiple systems weighing in. But maybe if you could tell me a little bit more about the idea of federated approaches, and possibly how does this actually help improve the fact that it's not dependent on any one weak link making a bad decision?
Certainly. Our military is progressing now aggressively in the federated machine learning space, which means artificial intelligence with algorithmic warfare at the edge. So you have the soldier at the edge in conflict, needing to receive that intel in near and real time to make those model training decisions with that intel. Our adversaries are at this now. We need to be able to compete on the edge. We do not have time with our enemies to wait to go back to a centralized data center location. We need that data to be on the edge for our soldiers to make those decisions to save Western democracy, to save lives, to instill that our soldiers are safe. And also, I believe for humanitarian effort, the federated machine learning piece is not just for our soldiers. It is for our armed services to support our refugees, to support humanitarian causes, to tackle those landmines, those sea mines. We are in the place to help humanity throughout the world. Thank you.
Well said. Well, and I like what you're saying, Sally, that it is about recognizing that, it's not like you can in the middle of a battlefield say, I've got to make a phone call whether or not I can actually shoot this bullet, or I got to make a phone call as to whether or not I can help this person. So it's about, putting in place the right safeguards and the right risk management and things like that. I also think, it's the analogy, and if I could ask just one last rejoinder, I mean, we train, for example, with canines. I mean, like canines, it's another form of intelligence. A dog by itself can be very vicious, or it can actually, do things that you don't expect. It could even run away. It could do all sorts of things. And that it's over time that we train the canines either to help with search and rescue, if it's a case where there's been an earthquake and you're trying to find traces of human life, or it's actually trying to provide additional defense, or it's even trying to sniff out IEDs, where we know that galvanizes can sniff out IEDs much better than other types of sensors we have. So maybe what we need to think about here is, when do we allow in this case, the AI, after having been sufficiently modeled and trained, to be off the leash for a little bit before it comes back, much like a canine? I'd be interested in your thoughts with that.
I would like to reference RAND. They did an outstanding intelligence defense report. The one takeaway, addressing your point, David, that I really keeps me up at night, the RAND report discussed when humans are making a decision in conflict, we as humans, for survival of each other, will hesitate before we decide on target action. Mm-hmm. We will take those extra precautions. We will go to our commanders. We will make decisions together. Machines, right now where we are with field testing on global warfare, as is, the machines are not yet at that conservative, taking a little more time on those decisions. And so through field testing, I hope our machines can be trained, which is very important for model training, to take that time to make all risk considerations for human life. Thank you.
Very well said, and I really appreciate all that you do as a positive agent, Sally, and I look forward to diving deeper into these issues with you on the show. So I also like to now welcome a longtime friend of the GeoTech Center, as well as senior fellow, Dr. Joe Bonneville. So Joe, for your perspective on why this is so important and why these are topics that we should be discussing now, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for being on the panel, and I truly think this is an awesome topic that we're talking about today, so I'm going to be interested to hear what everybody else has to say. When I think about autonomous systems and I think about artificial intelligence, I kind of go back, and there's a fear, I think, a fear that people have, kind of like, JV, I like to do this. I have to reference some movie, something like that. I'm going to reference iRobot, right? Everybody thinks that, we're going to be told what's going to happen to us. We're going to be told how to live, where to go, because this system is going to decide for us what we want to do. I think that's a fear. You go back to the 40s, and Asimov decided to say, robots cannot kill a human. Robots must listen to a human. And I think the third law was robots must protect themselves. And so as long as it's not violating the other two laws. I don't think that that's where we're at. I don't think we're close to that. I think that we are in a system, to Sally's point earlier, where these robots or these automated systems themselves, they have to simulate what's going on. They have to plan, act, and then sense the outcomes. And they need to continue to do this over and over again in a repeated loop so that we can understand where these systems are going to go and what kind of outcome you're going to get from any kind of tactical, from a tactical point of view, but also from any other point of view, from a humanitarian point of view. I think that as it's defined right now, the DoD, I think it's DoD 3000.99, if I'm remembering right, we don't have a definition for lethal autonomous weapon systems. We actually just say that it's a human out of the loop. It doesn't say we can or can't do it, but it just says the human's out of the loop, which is a scary thing to think of, right? And so I think that we need to do this training and to do this federated learning and to do synthetic data and simulate the entire real world real world in order to try to understand how these systems are going to react, because we need to be able to describe and understand what these systems did and why. And if they don't have that conscious moment where human would say, I don't think that's the right target, or that might be a hospital instead of another facility. We need to have that brief pause in order to kind of move through with saying we are comfortable using this type of autonomous system for artificial intelligence and autonomous system for lethal forces.
Well, I really like what you say about, Joe, that it's really about making sure we have explainability. And I do wonder if maybe this is actually an opportunity for us, because let's be honest, I mean, how many times does a human do something, or even more, dare I say, given so many people, a legislative body or a group of lawyers, just saying, not to pick on them, but when a decision is made by a court, or a decision is made by a jury, or a decision is made by a group of people, how often do we actually have explainability? I mean, people might say, I went with it because it felt right, or I went with it because it seemed right, but maybe this is actually a chance that by pairing humans with machines, we might actually get greater explainability, not just in the machine, but greater decision in actually the human decision making. I mean, I've got a 4-year-old right now, and he was actually very creative. He wanted more hummus, and he'd been eating a lot of hummus. And I said, well, first you need to eat some more chicken. And he says, but the hummus doesn't stick to the chicken as well. I need more bread. And so he was being very, very logical and trying to do what he wanted to pursue, even if it was an interesting approach. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts, is that maybe what we could actually have here is the explainability, Joe, could actually help elucidate the decision-making of the humans, either individually or in large groups, just as much as what the machine does too.
Absolutely. I think the key there is, and to your point, I think we as humans cannot process the data as fast as these machines are doing, right? But I think that allows us to, for ISR or intelligence surveillance, we can look over a large area of things, and the machine can point out an anomaly for us, and then we can make a decision. I think the most successful cases I've seen from AFRL and other places within the DoD is that when you pair that human up with the ability and the computing power of the machine and the autonomous system, you then get to move forward. You move your society forward in a much more efficient and effective fashion. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think we've got to figure out a way to say, we let you do all of the computing and the numbers in the background, and then pop out something to us that we look out and say, I think that's good or that's not good. And as we make a decision, that system is then still learning itself. So it's learning the decision we made based upon the decision the output that it's given us. And so as it gets more transparent, it starts to understand, well, my human told me that this was probably not what I want to do. So he told me that last time. So this time I'm going to make a recommendation not to do that or to do it. So I think you're absolutely right. I think you have to pair these things. AFRL is doing a really good job of doing that right now. And so I'm interested as we talk about the policies that are going to be coming out in the next, 10 to 12 months on where we're going to go in that avenue.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Joe. And I appreciate everything you're doing as a positive change agent. And I will say that really the big goal that we have for the conversations here on this GeoTech Hour is to sort of be the vanguard for what needs to happen in the next 6 to 12 to 9 months ahead. I will also raise that for those in our audience, if you're interested in these topics, aside from the things that you can find on the GeoTech website, there is the most recently released commission on the geopolitical impacts of new technologies and data. It was a 14-month bipartisan effort that has recommendations that span the gamut in several of these places. You can find it at atlanticcouncil.org/geotech report. That's atlanticcouncil.org/geotech report if you're interested in more information. And I also want to just say, just for full disclosure, that everybody here is representing their personal selves. Nobody is representing any institution, just to make sure that everyone understands this is personal conversations here. And now I'd like to have a longtime friend of the GeoTech Center, positive change agent that has done a lot of good in linking technology efforts to both the warfighter, but also to thinking about how it actually helps humanity and helps actually improve the cause of democracy. So Dana, you have also been looking at these issues from multiple perspectives, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about why is this such an important set of issues and conversations to be having now?
David, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really humbled to join this group of subject matter experts, so thank you so much. This is a really critical topic, and as ever, Atlantic Council GeoTech Center and you are leading the way in these policy discussions. There's a lot of, I think that the previous speakers have already gotten to the point. There's a lot of issues with a lack of definitions, a lack of clarity. A lot of these technologies are new enough that policy is still lagging behind. So I think it's important that we, we keep pushing the thought leaders to contemplate these issues before it's gotten ahead of them. And technology tends to lead policy anyway. I think we all know that. We're already seeing the future of warfare now. We're seeing the battlefield of tomorrow is happening. In the case of special operations forces, they're using autonomous systems for AI-enabled autonomous systems for surveillance, ISR, as Dr. Joe mentioned, real-time mapping, and in areas where there is a GPS denied, communications denied environment. And I think to the point that some of the speakers have made thus far, really mitigating risk is enabling those operators on the edge to have tools that enable them to be effective, safe, and really we're saving lives with autonomous systems. And what we're able to do is on the tactical edge, mitigate risk by putting robots, smart machines in the place of a 19-year-old with a gun. So instead of breaching a door, instead of going into a subterranean environment that's unknown, we can carry biochem sensors, we can carry ISR and mapping tools and give these operators some situational awareness they would otherwise not have. And that also mitigates unnecessary lethality on the side of civilians and people that maybe we don't want to harm. They're not after us. We just don't know where we are. And it's, a human can make mistakes. I mean, machines can make mistakes depending on how we use them, and any tool can. It's really about how the human chooses to use that tool. And I think in the case of autonomous systems, it's absolutely critical that we, America and our partners are leading the way in AI. We know that autonomous systems are being used on the battlefield now for lethal purposes. If you look at the Libyan civil war, if you look at what happened recently with Azerbaijan and Armenia, we have examples of drones that are effectively taking some lethal action. So, it's much like the nuclear triad. If we don't have the tool, we don't have the deterrent. So to mitigate risk, I think we really need to invest, be aggressive about investment. I was encouraged to see this year that the Department of Defense has increased the AI machine learning budget about 50% to 874 million. And that's a positive, that's very positive. What we need to make sure though is that we're not doing all this work in the lab, that we're actually, exactly as Sally said, getting into field testing and fielding these capabilities. We've got to get faster than the POM. The POM is not reactive enough for the threats that we're seeing.
Well, I like what you said. Multiple things that you said there. One, you're talking about with the annual, the more than annual budget cycle. That if we're talking about tightening the OODA loop and making our decisions faster, then we also need to think about our budget cycle actually being able to respond to these things. Because if we're dealing with these issues and we're trying to plan 3 to 4 years in advance, technology has a lot of change in that period of time. But I also like what you shared, Dana, that tools can make mistakes, people can make mistakes. And if I can maybe sort of give a scenario in which there is a case where already in some respects we're trusting a more simplistic form. It's not machine learning, it's more rules-based, but it is still for the case of defibrillators, automatic defibrillators. That's a case where it's actually a human using it. It's trying to figure out when is the right time to give your shock to your heart or not. It may even say, look, your heart is not in the right condition to give a shock. And that could kill someone if you do it wrong. And so we seem to trust AEDs. They're located in airports. They're located in a lot of facilities around the world. We seem to trust that which actually does have lethal capability if used incorrectly. Why is that? Why is it that we seem to be okay with AEDs? And I'd be interested in your thoughts, but some of these other things we get a little bit more concerned. Is it the scope of control we're giving to the machine? Is it that it's a new foreign concept? Or is it worse? Is it the case of where Hollywood effect has shown us the Terminator and other movies, and so we get our perceptions of what an AI can do, and nobody looks at an AED and say, well, technically that's also AI that can actually either save a human life or kill a human life. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Dana.
I think it's absolutely a Hollywood aspect. I mean, slaughter bots is a great example of kind of making the public scared of an autonomous system. And again, any tool can be used for nefarious purposes, right? So I think it's in the hand of the user and in the intent of those users that really matters. We can and we should be developing some ethical guidelines and left and right boundaries for operations. But at the same time, we need to enable the lower levels of the command space to make those decisions in real time for the situation at hand. I think that's absolutely critical. There is some guidance recently that's coming out of DoD. There's a directive, DoD Directive 3000.09 that provides some AI, some guidance, which I think will be helpful for folks. And I'll actually so I don't screw it up, read that definition for lethal autonomous weapon system. It's defined in that directive as a weapon system that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by human operator, human out of the loop, or full autonomy, right? And so I think we're creating some definitions that still have some flexibility because the technologies are still being created and in development now. And I think that's important. I don't think we should put too many closed parameters on our operational space. Again, getting to allowing for commanders' intent and using the tools that they have available to execute that commander's intent. There's also a recent memorandum by the Deputy Secretary of Defense that came out May 26th that deals with implementing responsible artificial intelligence. So, our viewers can find that online and look at the parameters that are included there. It's essentially responsible, ethical, traceable, reliable, and governable. So, those are kind of, there's a lot of realm there to cover, but we're at least getting to a point where we're starting to create some definitions and guidance.
Very well said, and I appreciate you actually citing the progress that's being made, because a lot of progress has been made in the last year, and I think it just shows how much progress can be made in another 6 to 12 months as we dive deeper into these issues. Before I go real quick back to Joe, I'm going to actually go to Lord Tim with in a previous conversation, you were sharing a little bit of how you actually had a interview that was done by an AI and just how alien it was. And so I'd be interested if you could share with our audience that sometimes we can ascribe human aspects to what we think the machine's going to do, when in fact it's anything but human. So I'd be interested if you could share that, Lord Tim.
Well, that's why I absolutely take on board what Sally had to say, because machines do not take decisions in the same way as humans. And it was quite unnerving to have an interview with a recruitment AI. I mean, this was for peaceful purposes, this was a recruitment AI, which was trying to see whether I would fit this particular role. And as soon as it decided that my skills were not the ones that they were looking for, frankly, you were of no consequence. Now, it was quite chilling to see the approach of the machine, which had been trained to look very carefully for those skills, to make sure that they were absolutely focused on filling that role. But if you were not, at all of interest, you then ceased really to be of any importance. And and it was really extraordinary to be interviewed in that way. And you really felt as though this was somebody who just landed from Mars, not even somebody, something that had landed from Mars that was interrogating you. And so that's why, what Sally had to say struck such a chord. Now, then you start thinking, well, do you always have to have a human in the loop for lethal applications? And, I think that drives you towards that conclusion. Then you have the gray areas and so on and so forth. But I'm absolutely delighted to hear from Dana that the US DoD, it has moved really quite far, further than any other NATO country, as far as I know. And you've also had the US National Security Commission report, which I think is highly significant, actually, in a sense, demonstrating an overall policy approach. The DoD were very early in with their ethical guidelines, and so I think one takes some comfort from that. But I think when we come to, well, what can we do about all this? I think there are things that we need to move a bit further on.
Very well said, and I appreciate you sharing that story, because I think it helps put in context that sometimes we can either A, ascribe the Terminator to it, which is not exactly accurate, or B, we think it's going to be just like us, which is not exactly accurate too. It is something fundamentally different, and I think that's again where we have to say, think about how it'd be like to interact with very sophisticated mathematics, and that is sometimes far into the human experience. And so Dr. Joe, as I go to you, I want to sort of talk about one of the things we've hosted in the past, folks from the National Security Commission on AI, and recognizing they did a lot of work on the AI. One of the things that we've also been amplifying is the need to think about the data, because we know that the current way of AI being done, specifically the subset known as machine learning, depends on the data that's given to it. And if it's given bad data, then garbage in, garbage out. So how can we put safeguards on the data that's being done, or at least some checks on the data, without necessarily giving all the data to the public? Because there's certain data that you just don't want to make open to everybody. How do we make sure that the right data is being fed to train the machine well?
I think the key on that is actually, thank you for that question. I was just thinking about something that leads to your point. I think the key is that the data has to be as diverse as possible. And what I mean by that is, if you all, again, another movie, a show reference, but if you haven't seen Coded Bias on Netflix, I highly recommend everybody check that out. It talks about the history of artificial intelligence and how it started with, the ability to play chess, and how it's essentially all of the codes came from white men that were looking at coding for facial recognition. And so if someone like myself, a Black man, was to show up, it wouldn't recognize me, and it wouldn't be able to make a decision for me. To Lord Tim's kind of point, it kind of just X'd you out and moved you to the left here. I think we have to be cognizant of that. We have to recognize that fact, that we have to give these machines, all they're doing is processing. They're just processing the data, and you've got to give it as much data as you can and as much diverse data as you can in order to truly look at the simulations and kind of look at the checks and balances. To your second point, though, I do think we need to have some type of decision support system that goes through that says, okay, after all of these decisions, there's a checkpoint here that says we needed to look back and see where that data came from and does it make sense. I think that'll bring the trust to the system and the transparency to the system to the outside users, as well as being able to hold somebody accountable for the decision. Because right now, if we just allow the autonomous system to make a decision for us, we're holding the system accountable, but where does that trace back to? And so as long as you have that decision support system and a diversity of data, as much data as possible. I mean, when I'm talking, we've got a lot of data right now. We've got IoT, out the wazoo, but as much data as possible so that you can continue to look at all of the simulated outcomes. I think that'll help to build trust in the community and also allow us to make these decisions and be able to feel comfortable with the decisions we make, particularly in the military side.
Very well said. And I liked how you talked about the importance of diversity of data and being linked to explainability. And again, going to the example of my 4-year-old when he was younger, when he was a 2-year-old once, we were out for a walk and I was pushing him in the stroller, and he saw a small dog, but he said, "Look at that cat." And I was like, well, given his breadth of experience so far, dogs are big. And if it's something small that has 4 legs, it must be a cat. And that was, of course, wrong. And so I think you're very spot on, Joe, that we need to expose data. Do you have a quick rejoinder? And then I'm going to go from there. I saw Sally was also raising her hand. So Joe first.
So my question, I actually have a question for the panel. David, I know you're hosting, but I always I'm so enthralled with all of the people that we have here. And my question is, which actually came off of the question itself came from someone else in the chat here, but does increasing autonomy of these machines imply that we're decreasing human autonomy, right? And so as they're making decisions for us, are we losing the decision-making process that we go through on a daily basis? If someone tells me, if I have an automated machine tell me, hey, you don't want to go to this park right now because it's unsafe, and I don't go to that park, I've now lost the choice. And so when I start to think about these things, this is a very large 30,000 foot kind of question, but it was something that was kind of, kicked in my mind, like, as something is making choices for me, am I losing the ability to make choices for myself?
How many people can read a map nowadays?
Absolutely. GPS, absolutely. Great point.
Or how many people have a map in their car in the event that GPS goes down? I've often wondered that would be an interesting sci-fi novel of the satellites are knocked out and only the people that have maps in their cars are the ones that survive.
Yeah, that's just a thought process for the panelists and everyone that's in the audience. It's something that keeps me up at night, if you will.
Well, here's the other question to sort of build on that. How many people selectively go to news sites that may disagree with their whatever views of the world are on a regular basis? And so if you're reliant on a news feed, it's probably the machine already making decisions for you as to what you want to get. And I can guarantee you, if that news feed has an incentive to keep you continuously engaged, you're going to be delivered news that makes you angry or fearful, as opposed to news that says, you know what, the world's actually doing pretty okay. So yeah, I do think it does point to, I'm not sure it's exactly net zero, but the question I think is maybe that we're asking as a group here is, how can we design the machine so it's not that the machine takes away human autonomy, but instead it amplifies and augments human autonomy? And maybe what we're actually dealing with here is an existential question for democracies and other forms of representative government. Is the thing that will decide as we look back 10 to 15 years from now, which societies chose technologies and data approaches that uplifted human individuality as well as collective action versus those that took away human individuality and collective action as well.
It's a really important point, David, particularly in the military, one would have thought, because if you aren't able to operate flexibly, responding to a particular emergency, because in a sense some of your skills have been taken away, you're over reliant on a piece of kit that actually has failed, then you're in trouble. That's a very interesting point.
Well, it's interesting because I know lately the Army the U.S. Army had a campaign, and it was several years ago, on an Army of One. The idea that yes, you were part of a collective, but it was also about individual. And it seems to be going slightly back in that direction. I don't know if it's using that exact slogan, but you're absolutely right. It's about making sure that you're not so dependent on your kit failing, because if your kit fails, it could be your life, it could be the life of civilians. Bad things happen, and so I think this is an interesting question, both from a military context, but also, where do we want to go? What distinguishes what we consider to be open, free societies versus those that are not open and free societies? With that, though, I noticed, Sally, you did have a rejoinder a little while back, so I'll go to you, and then I'll go from there to Dana.
Thank you. First and foremost, Lord Tim, I just want you to know that my father would be most appreciative of how you fold the map, not necessarily reading that map. So I will make sure to share that with him, reading, but yet I add to our audience, make sure you learn how to fold that baby back in the right place. A second point to Dr. Joe Bonneville, I really appreciate diversity. And I have to tell you, Joe, every single meeting, top of mind, throughout our intelligence, military space, cleansing. And with my hero, who I work for day in, day out, Dr. David Bauer, who was the original architect for AI/ML systems for the NSA and CIA, we do not want to cleanse, because you are absolutely right, Dr. Joe Bonneville. We need all that data, which learns and grows within itself to make those decisions for everyone, for all considerations. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think there are some questions that our young engineers have about making sure to cleanse that data. So I hope that's an important point that we will continue to collaborate on. And my third point, which I really want to do a shout out, David, I really appreciate your misinformation, disinformation. Then we go into propaganda. The State Department is doing an colossal effort with their Global Engagement Center. The DHS has a new misinformation campaign, social media terrorism office, and these two incredible agencies, DHS and State Department, are really making strides in this area about what data is being hacked into, whether it's being transferred, and there's no homomorphic encryption from data center to data center, whether that satellite is good. As you know, the soldiers may just have an hour's worth of feed time. And my fourth point I'd like to close with, as we'll circle back around, is something called, and Dana, you're familiar with this, no code, low code. As these systems develop and we get further away from augmentation, it is so important, and I go back to this every single conversation we have, Dr. David Bray, which is the training of our engineers and our young scientists and our military men and women on these systems. So we do need to beef that up incredibly in the data science realm. Thank you.
Very well said, Sally. And what you made me remember, there was experiments that were done in the 80s and 90s where they played the bargaining game with the computer, where the computer was going to make you offers. They told them in advance. The computer had already been pre-programmed to make an offer. You had to decide whether or not you thought it was fair enough. If you thought it was fair, you could accept. If not, you could reject the offer, thereby, in theory, punishing the machine. Now, what's interesting is they said they were going to give you what the computer was going to do in an envelope that you could open up later, and you could see it would do exactly what it was programmed to do. But given that context, if you thought about it rationally, you should accept everything the computer offers you, even if it's a very low offer of, say, just a penny, because you should accept everything. But still, people persisted in rejecting certain offers they thought were unfair from the computer, even though it had already been pre-programmed to behave a certain way. And that just shows The challenge was not the computer. The computer was programmed to do things exactly a certain way. It was that we thought we were interacting with a human and we were trying to bargain with a machine that couldn't be bargained with. And so I think this gets to the larger question, which is our brains are not ready for an intelligence that is foreign than ours, with the exception possibly be, again, dogs. And I know, Dana, you had some cats as well that were representing the feline species. And I raise that because I think it's going to be so key, because we're going to see weird behaviors emerge when humans interact with machines. And if I could real quick, before we go to Dana, share a personal note as someone who back in 2017 did have a case where there were a whole lot of bots. They weren't very smart bots, but there were a whole lot of bots that were flooding at the time, a place where I was working with lots of millions of comments. I raise that because at the time, the public, I don't think, knew how to make sense of them. They were trying to figure out if they were real or not. They thought maybe it was fake comments being submitted by people. And in some sense, they were being submitted by people just through bots that were programmed to behave a certain way. But it turned out at the end of the day, 3.5 years later, what we found out, thanks to New York Attorney General, 85% of the comments were submitted by bots of some form from multiple organizations. And this was just, it was overloading the normal way of representing people in just a representative public space. And it denied service and denied access to those people. And so I raise it because I think we're going to see a lot of interesting emergent behaviors that are not expected from humans when they respond to how the machine is behaving, as either it's been programmed to do or how it's learned how to do. And so I think it's going to be actually thinking about like almost a second and third order game, which is not just how do we make sure the machine does what it's supposed to do, but then how do we make sure that human responses to those machines are also in a way that's consistent with what we want. And so Dana, not to put you on the spot, but sort of thinking about how we use these things in a medical context, in a first responders context, I'd be interested in your thoughts about how these can actually be a force for good and actually saving people's lives.
Absolutely. I mean, think about a forest fire. You have planes, you have aerial vehicles that are manned going into these dangerous scenarios, taking humans to surveil the environment. If you can do that with an unmanned system and scout the area without putting a human in danger, it's very similar to the defense applications and mitigating risk at that last 100 meters, right? So I think anytime you can provide capability that augments the human, does that mean we're going to need to use different skill sets? To Dr. Joe's point, are we losing a certain skill because we may have to develop others? That's a culture change that will have to occur with the entire operating community, whether it's first responders or defense. You have pilots and boat drivers who may not be happy about autonomous aerial vehicles or autonomous boats, right? But that's I think technology forces cultures into a shift for trade and for skill sets. So that's going to be something we have to think about in advance of them actually, the capability actually being widely disseminated, I think. But the applications for the first responder realm, I think, are very similar to the defense space, really mitigating risk, enhancing that human operator to have more eyes and ears in a situation, and enhance situational awareness.
Very well said, Dana. And I really like how you say that it can actually give a broader picture of coordination that no human would be able to do, just given the sheer amount of data as well as real time. And that's where it can actually play a role with responding to forest fires, where they can play a role in responding to national disasters. It does raise a question that I'm going to now go to Lord Tim on the what side, which is maybe how we can actually make this real in terms of advancing positive ways forward. Do we need to start having the equivalent of almost like expert review boards that review a decision a machine made, almost like when you have like doctors, when doctors do surgery, if something goes wrong or if something didn't exactly intend up as right, there's a medical review board by other peers. Do we need to have review boards that review both the fielding of a technology that has some autonomous system approach towards it, but also afterwards doing a review board too and say, was this a case where something went outside of expectation, and what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Well, I think that's an interesting trajectory, in fact, David. I mean, what I'd like to see is a convergence, really, between Europe and the States, because I think at the moment, there isn't the appetite yet. It may happen under the Biden administration yet for sort of further regulation. That may be for, if you like, operationalizing the ethics to a greater degree. But as you've seen, as I'm sure the panel have seen, the EU have started with really a proposal for a regulation that has a hierarchy of risk. Now, I'm afraid I'm a fan of that, because I don't think, if you like, what you might describe as corporate governance is not really good enough. And, you know, it could be corporate governance within government, for heaven's sake, as well as in the private sector. But I do think that actually there are certain kinds of risk, you know, for instance, biometrics and, you know, a number of areas of use of AI where you have to say to yourself, you have to have a compulsory impact assessment. I mean, that's perhaps another phrase for the sort of thing you were talking about, David. You have to have that, and you have to basically conform to a certain set of standards of accountability, clear liability, transparency, etc., etc. Otherwise, you can't deploy it. And there are certain technologies which actually will be beyond the pale. Now, that may not be fantastic sounding to somebody who wants to use every form of technology for every form of military adventure, but you know, even the recent review by the US talked about limitation, basically, by international agreement. Now, you know, if we can do it for nuclear weapons, we can certainly do it for autonomous lethal weapons. And we just have to find a decent definition. And I'm absolutely delighted that the US has already started that process. Of course, you'll get rogue actors, but that gives you the international authority to then stop them in their tracks, because already, I think Sally alluded to it earlier, we're already seeing the deployment of autonomous drones. And you know, this is becoming real. This is no longer theoretical. So these negotiations really do have to get real now.
Well, and I agree with you on the urgency, particularly with making sure we can link activities with Europe, with NATO, and what's happening there. Because if we don't act on this quickly, as we've already seen, all technologies eventually get democratized, and things that only nation states can do ultimately will end up in the hands of consumers. And while some consumers will use this for good, or some of this will use it for mundane purposes, how will we feel when, for example, paparazzi are using autonomous systems and drones to follow around people or harass certain people? And then, of course, it's also worth noting that already, just in the last week, TikTok said in their terms of services that they reserve the right to record and measure your biometrics. So guess what? You're teaching the machine if you're not thinking about it. So Lord Tim, I guess real quick before I go to our other panelists on the how question, how do we get possibly NATO to the table to care about this, and how do we get others to care about this?
Well, there is quite a movement out there, in fact. There's the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, and talks have already begun. There's an expert group called the Group of Government Experts, GGE for short, that's already started talking about it. But because there is no accepted definition internationally of lethal autonomous weapon systems, you know, that's a jolly good excuse not to take things much further. You know, this is why the semantics really do matter. But I'm sure that if the US say, look, put a stake in the ground and say, yeah, we do have a definition, I think people would follow, you know, and that's what gives me heart. I do think the current administration is going to take this seriously.
Very well said. I appreciate that. I'm now going to jump now to Sally, then to Joe, and then to Dana. Again, this is real quick on the how before we go to the lightning round. Are there any other how steps that you think we should move this forward? Sally, Joe, and Dana. Sally first.
Super fast. I am a huge fan of NIST. I followed the NIST guidelines for all of my work, former cybersecurity in the domain, and love to always throw out, yes, the humans are the weakest link, but in this conversation, that joke that we love in with our security friends, are humans the weakest link? So I just rise that for those of us who have played in the security space and now moving into this autonomous space. So my answer is NIST all the way. And Dana, I actually really appreciate all of your comments about what Special Forces is doing. That was incredibly insightful. And I know we're all trying to help educate and supply with best tools and capabilities. Thank you.
Very well said. And I really appreciate both the shout out to NIST, but also your point saying that we should be ready for machines that we think have been trained to behave a certain way. There's going to be a whole new science and discipline of tricking the machine to behave in ways that that seem to be normal when in fact it breaks. And in fact, we've already seen that with, for example, stop signs with little pieces of tape in certain places. Looks normal to us, but it makes the machine no longer be able to recognize the stop sign. So Joe, your thoughts on the how before we go to the lightning round.
Sure. I think I'll be quick. I think the how, one of the things we've talked a lot here in this conversation about what's going on for the military, other than what you mentioned earlier. But I think we should also look at the fact that, industry and corporations are developing AI, and they're not doing it in this silo that we think about when we think about the military. I think we need to open that up. Project Bonsai out of Microsoft is a great example, where they're not siloing the development of AI. They're essentially crowdfunding or crowdsourcing this development of AI for different purposes. I think if we begin to do that and try to look at that from a larger scale, we can move a lot faster in a more efficient way. I do think, to your other point though, cybersecurity on AI is going to be one of the biggest things that comes out in the next 5 to 10 years. Like the understanding and being able to break a system or being able to trick a system into doing what you want it to do for nefarious purposes, and then being able to red team, blue team that. I think that's going to be a very big point. We didn't get to that, but just something to put kind of in the high sight for people to talk about.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely spot on that it's going to be thinking about, one, how do we engage industry, because industry should be a part of these conversations, and like you said, may not be necessarily having the same level of in-depthness that we've already seen in the defense realm. And then two, like you said, this is going to be a very interesting space. One small example, if you have satellites in space that are programmed, if they detect what they think is a radiation event, to go into rad hardening mode. Well, what if you can trick it into thinking it's in rad hardening mode? And guess what? The satellite has now turned off conversations for the next 6 to 8 hours or something like that. And so, yeah, this is going to be a very challenging space. And so, Dana, your thoughts on the how, and then we'll transition to lightning round.
Thank you, David. And thanks for the remarks that Dr. Joe just made on that too. I completely concur with that, and Sally's as well. The cyber connection's key, and that gets to really what is trusted AI. And I don't think we have an answer yet for that, but that maybe is part of the next discussion, I hope. I think what's really critical is that we have a coordinated investment. I'm going to speak more to the DoD space right now. A coordinated investment across the department so that you don't have pockets of investment doing same research and development and fielding. Really incentivizing the best in breed of industry, academia, and government engineering to work together for the best rapid accelerated outcome of capability for the warfighter on the edge. I think that's really not something that organically happens within the Department of Defense. There's no one person whose job it is to coordinate disparate efforts across the DoD and make sure they're moving in the same direction. That's going to save taxpayer money. It's going to expand the effectiveness of taxpayer money. So I think that's really critical that we figure out a way to do that, whether that's industry driven, policy driven by the Congress directing it, or the DoD figuring out how to do that themselves. But really getting people together so that when you're expending your dollars, you're doing it in a way to make the maximum impact for the maximum diversity of capability.
Well said, and I think you're absolutely right that this is an opportunity both within the United States, but also with our allies and partners internationally to figure out what parts of the different S&T pieces of the puzzle we want to tackle. And actually, this was not planned, but actually the opening chapter 1 of the GeoTech Commission report, actually that's actually what we lead with is if we think that we can go alone on this, then we're probably wrong. We do need to work with allies and partners, and as the Atlantic Council says, stronger together with allies. So with that, now I'm going to go to the lightning round, which means I'm going to go first to Dana, then to Joe, then to Sally, and then to Lord Tim for the close. This is your chance to give us 3 tweet length recommendations, 2 to 3 tweet length recommendations for leaders in the public or the private sector that can actually help move us forward on the, if the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, each of you get to give the chance to give your 2 to 3 tweet length recommendations on those steps. And with that, Dana, I'll go to you first.
Sure thing. So tweet length. I'm going to say really accelerate, simplify the budget process, invest aggressively, field capability. We need to get things out of the labs into the hands of warfighters and get real life feedback and develop in that direction.
Very well said, and that was extremely succinct. You were incredibly succinct, Dana. So you get the 100 points for being probably the most succinct with the lightning round that we've had in so far in the GeoTech Hour. Thank you for that, and you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. There are some self-made obstacles that, if we actually remedy those obstacles, can make things better for all. So thank you for that, Dana. So Dr. Joe, to you, what are your tweet links recommendations here?
Include the human in the decision support system process. Do not silo the systems. Make the systems open and transparent, and include scientists and engineers in the policy discussions that happen on the Hill.
Wow, absolutely. Well, again, spot on, and I really appreciate it. And both you and Dana must have like practiced your like lightning round game, because like that is impressive, impressively succinct, and I think your recommendations are spot on. And including, like you said, including scientists, technologists with the policy discussions will lead to better conversations as opposed to siloing that. All right, Sally. So far we've had 2 rounds of the lightning round so far that have been great. Your chance to now up your game as well. What are your tweet links recommendations here?
In the age of thinking machines, let's go to number 1. I really think we should look at what we're doing with nuclear deterrent guidelines. Number 2, let's go back to that testing that I mentioned earlier. And Joe, I love red team, blue team. So we've got to tabletop this out. And number 3, training. Let's help our war fighters with low code, no code, and ease of use and AI for all. Thank you.
Very well said. So I see. Okay, so you all have definitely been practicing your lightning round game. I'm really impressed, Sally. I loved how you said, let's think about how we can draw from the lessons of nuclear deterrence, and then, like you said, training. If we don't practice as we plan to actually operate in real environments, then don't be surprised if things go pineapple later. So thank you for that, Sally. Okay, so Lord Tim, your chance to bring it home for us.
I'm going to fail this test, David.
Okay.
This is all about international agreement. Basically, I want to see the development of an ethical, risk-based approach to AI development and application. I want to see a focus on the sustainable development goals and the way that AI can crack those. And then I'm with Sally. I want to see a limit on lethal autonomous weapons, internationally agreed.
Wow, I don't think you failed at all. I think you all did wonderful. You did great, Lord Tim, and I really like your, again, emphasis that we should think about UN SDGs, that the Sustainable Development Goals is a chance here beyond the realm of necessary defense. How can we actually begin to pair machines working with humans to actually accomplish this for the planet? And so I really appreciate you raising that as well. Again, you all have been tremendous panelists and discussants here today. Thank you, Lord Tim. Thank you, Dr. Joe. Thank you, Sally and Dana. Thank you for all that you do outside of this as well, and being positive change agents. And I would recommend to everyone in the audience to check out your bios, because you are very impressive positive change agents in your own right. Thanks to the audience that asked some very lively questions that I tried to weave in as I asked questions of the panelists. Please join us next Wednesday for another GeoTech Hour. And as we like to say here at the Atlantic Council, as always, please be bold, please be brave, please be benevolent for the future ahead. I'll see you next time.